So this is the reading for victims, with the major focus on seeing how kind of getting the mindset of some other Southerners, specifically those in the mountain region, but also helping us look at what was happening in the South in general as the war went on. So I'm going to read different sections and talk to you about what you need to be thinking about in different sections. So for this first part, you need to be thinking about how did the slave economy breed discontent or make people unhappy? And the reading goes, such sentiments would later surface throughout North Carolina, though predominantly in the western half, in the accusation that the conflict was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Visiting the state shortly after Appomattox, Cindy Andrews observed that much of the unionism of western North Carolina, of which we heard so much during the war, was less a love for the Union than a personal hatred of those who went into rebellion. It was not so much an uprising for the government as against a certain ruling class. Of course, local feelings and experience shaped loyalties too. As the mountaineers became isolated from the outside world, they became more isolated from one another. So then it goes on to talk about, thus the hostility of the mountaineers towards slaveholders and a system that benefited them in no clear way, the growing isolation and poverty of the mountains, and also family and neighborhood traditions and personal antagonisms laid the groundwork for the Unionist feelings and sent soldiers to the Union lines. In the early days of the war, hundreds of men tried to get to Union regions in Kentucky to enlist in Lincoln's forces. More often than not, they left their families behind, for the journey was a dangerous one and demanded stealth and the ability to move fast and often risk capture and maybe death. Although hundreds moved north, most of the mountaineers stayed in the valleys in which they had been born and raised. Many were trapped inside the Confederacy and had little choice. Most would try to avoid service to one side or the other. They would try to live on and hope that their steep ridges would hold back the tides of war. Out of this population, however, it was easy to raise armed men to prey upon the Confederates. The advantage of such service of these men were clear. They could fight when it suited them and yet comfort themselves with the thought that they were protecting the grand old flag and the Union of their fathers. They could foray quickly against rebel railroads, bridges, supplies, and then vanish swiftly in security in the mountains and return to the comforts of home. So in this part, you need to be thinking about how did this benefit the Union, these mountaineers, and this Union sentiment. No strangers to order a man about fighting. It talks about why they like this type of fighting. It then goes to talk about this, not to say that the men of the mountains were all loyalists. The promise of quick victory, the slogans proclaiming succession and salvation from a centralized coercion, the excitement of the moment, the glory of protecting home, family, friends from Lincoln and his black Republicans. These inspired enlistment in the armies of the Greys. There were also mountaineers going to the Confederate side. So what you need to think about this next part, what does this say about the culture of the South? Such as among the Confederate loyalists were many poor people. The charge that Lincoln's government intended to unleash a racial revolution in the South was ceaseless. Poor whites, profoundly hostile to blacks and most vulnerable to any change in social and economic structure, accepted disunion and declarations of independence for racial purity's sake. One thing that distinguished poor supporters of disunion from poor supporters may have been that the latter owned some land and were further away from the slave population. Basically saying that while we did talk about mountaineers fighting for the Union side and why they might have done that in revolt basically against the ruling class, there's also was that sentiment of the South of racial superiority and protecting their homes as well. So you see actually a conflict going on right within the South in this mountainous region. Okay? All right, so going to the next part, we want to think about how this is similar to North and would cause issues. All right, the South, what they're going to be doing with conscription or drafts. Raids by Confederate soldiers were not the only threats to people of Shelton Laurel. Even as Irwin's troops marched away, events unfolded that would make the war more than just an occasional intruder. On April 16, 1862, the Confederate Congress passed the new nation's first draft law. The first surge of enthusiasm that had swelled the gray ranks was subsiding, and compulsion was needed to sustain the fight for independence. All able-bodied men 18 to 35 years old were made eligible for conscription by the Confederate government. There were few exceptions, of course. Most government officials, state and national, All right, it talks about professors and other people. And then also, the law allowed men to pay substitutes to serve in their place. None of these exceptions, of course, offered relief to more than a small fraction of the people of western North Carolina. To rural mountain people, they offered none. So how would that have caused issues, this conscription and people being able to pay for exemptions? What the draft did produce was a changed environment for the pro-unionist mountaineers of Madison County. First of all, it alienated earlier supporters of the Confederate cause. The large numbers of young men from the mountains who had joined the Army in 1861 were predominantly the farmers of the region. The prospect of having more men taken away to raise the specter of food shortages. Who would plant and harvest in the fields if the farmers were at war? Having voluntarily given so much to the cause, many mountain people resented facing deprivation due to coercion of the government. The only 2 votes in lower house Confederate Congress against the draft bill came from representatives of western North Carolina. Here were signs to encourage boldness from mountain unionists. Here was also reason to increase the fears and the anxieties of loyal rebels in and outside the mountains, perhaps lead to desperate countermeasures. Conscription also threw new light on the purpose for which the Confederacy fought. Fighting for the right to be left alone was cause for mountaineers could rally around. So they could rally around that for the Confederacy to fight to be left alone. Fighting for the right, being compelled or made to fight for that right, well, a man did not have to be very sophisticated to smell something wrong with that. Conscription then helped cause desertion. The draft might force men into the Army, but could not keep them there, and nowhere there was that more true than in the mountains. So basically, be thinking about what does that say about what was going on in the mountains and in the South in general, in terms of the mindset about the war, conscription, all that good stuff. Okay?